If you touch on this, you strike the bedrock of the reason we own India. The Indian is simply not fit to lead his men against Europeans. The Indian has none of the instincts which make for leaders in modern war.
When an Indian joined a British regiment, an Indian Army regiment, he expected his officer to deal with him in a variety of roles, not just as officer, also as father substitute, as trainer, as dispenser of favors, as dispenser of promotions. This was a man who had many, many roles in relation to the single individual. And when this man was lost, another man just couldn't step in and do it. It takes a while for an individual to develop all these relationships with a single person.
The repercussions of this were soon felt after the first battle.
When the Indian regiments lost their white officers, they became ineffective. Largely, I think, because the British recruited only from very backward classes, basically from the Punjab, the hill tribes, and they brought these people into the British Army, uneducated, ill-suited to be further educated because they were not modern people. They had learned to look to this white officer caste for guidance. When the white officer caste was gone, they simply sat and waited for another white officer to come along. Indeed, didn't even have to be an officer. Sometimes just a white infantryman coming over from a regiment next door could yell, "Follow me," and they would follow him. These were people who were not trained to have initiative, were not asked to have initiative, and as a result didn't have any.
Stranded in a country whose inhabitants, language and customs were entirely unknown to him, the ordinary sepoy had no way of understanding his surroundings. Deprived of his white officers, he was helpless.
Picture yourself as a young man from a village in the Punjab. You're transported thousands of miles, and you're placed into the mud and the death of France in 1914, where men are not being killed in ones and twos or even tens and twenties. They're being killed in thousands, hundreds and thousands. Your own regiment, 700 men go into the trenches, maybe 300 come out after one battle, where death is not an individual shooting at you. Death is this unseen artillery shell landing in the midst of your organization, an unseen machine gun wiping down your men in droves. Culture shock is perhaps a simple way to put it, but I think it's accurate.
In November 1914, winter set in, with cold, wet, biting winds.
By the 20th, the whole country was clothed in a deep mantle of snow. In the midst of the sea of mud, with scant bedding for so bitter a climate, lying in foul and insanitary trenches, often frozen hard, practically underground, dwelt in thousands men, to most of whom ice and snow were unknown, their only knowledge of it being the distant views some had obtained of the mighty Himalayas, peopled with myriad gods, towering like Titan sentinels over their hills and valleys.
The Indian divisions were shifted to the extreme south of the British line, a sector of no great importance, but it accustomed the men to the novelty of trench warfare without the likelihood of heavy casualties. By the end of November, it seemed to the British that the Indians had overcome the initial shock of combat. On the 23rd, the Indians were sent back into the line at Festubert. It was well known and heartily disliked by the soldiers because of its low-lying and swampy trenches. There were heavy losses. Rifles jammed with the mud. Bombs and ammunition failed.
All the men who have taken part in this war have become mingled with the mud. On both sides, each man kills his enemy, either with rifle or gun, while the rain and storm night and day do not cease, so that the trenches are filled and the soldiers suffer much trouble from the mud. And all the while machine guns fire on them and many men are killed. The whole world is defiled with mud so that one cannot describe it.
In a few days' time, you will hear that in our country, only the women will be left. All the men will be finished here. In the space of a few months, how many men have fallen and how many have been wounded?
The battle is but beginning. The men are dying like maggots. No one can count them.
not in thousands, but hundreds of thousands. None can count them. In the trenches, the snow rises from the feet to the neck, and the feet and the hands are frostbitten. The sun is never seen. But God's will is being done. Braziers burn in the trenches, and one gets as much liquor as one wants to drink as a protection from the cold. On the 24th day of the 12th month, there was a very fierce fight. The whole line moved forward, and the enemy's guns roasted our regiment, even as grain is parched. Corpses lay at every step, and blood ran in little rivers. Regiments are being annihilated. My eyes were filled with mud. We were not allowed to move hither or thither in the trench. But by the decree of God, the first bullet hit me in the forehead, above the left eye. For this reason, I came out of the trench. When I had gone a little way, I found that there were about 20 of the enemy in support trench who fired at me, hitting me in the thigh, breaking the leg. Being quite without assistance, I lay still, thinking what to do. After a little time, I began to push myself along on my back. I left my greatcoat there because it prevented me from moving. I struggled on my back for about 50 yards. Then, I had neither strength enough left to go on, nor the spirit enough to go back and fetch my greatcoat. Anguish and agony left me motionless there. What could I do? It was the will of God.
Festubert, Givenchy. It was a war in which ground was considered all-important, and places like Givenchy were taken, lost, and retaken with appalling loss of lives. Men just disappeared without trace. At Givenchy, a full double company of Gurkhas were blown skyward or buried in their trenches. The Indian battalions fled from the front. Wilcox reported that his troops were finished and would have to be relieved immediately. By the end of 1914, the Indians had lost over 8,000 officers and men, or nearly 50% of their initial strength.
It looks as if not a single man can remain alive on either side. Then, when none is left, there will be peace. Only those return from the battlefield who are slightly wounded. No one else is carried off. Even the Saabs are not lifted away. The battleground resounds with cries. So far as is in your power, my friend, do not come here. If you come, get yourself written down ill or something in Marseille and say that you're weak. Sick men do not come to the war.
Days seem like years, but I have no confidence for 5 minutes of what will happen. Do not consider this untrue. Hundreds of regiments have been turned to rubbish, straw, and grass. There is a strict order against writing any more.
Father, tell my dear mother not to go wandering madly, because her son, my brother, is dead. To be born and to die is God's order. We must all die sooner or later. And if I die here, who will remember me? It is a fine thing to die far from home.
Far from home wasn't just the grim trenches of Flanders. If wounded, a soldier might find himself shipped to Brighton. Along the south coast of England was a string of hospitals and convalescent homes caring for the Indian war wounded. This was the Indians' home from home in Brighton, the royal pavilion.